Welcome to Wing Zero Duality. On this episode, we ask whether thought is always limited. And we're not asking whether thought of a particular politician, of a particular representative of a religious denomination, a particular military commander, a particular expert or commentator or podcaster, and so on. We're asking whether thought is limited in general. And in daily living, thought makes for an analyzation of people, places, and things, does it not? Such an analyzation requires for there to be an analyzer, analyzing in detail, in reference, in comparison. And we find that perhaps this division between analyzer and analyzed is in correlation with inner conflict. And sometimes even such inner conflict permeates into outer conflict. So, where there's conflict, is there not limitation of some sort? And so perhaps such inner conflict and outer conflict, permeated by the analyzation of an analyzer, is limited. Now, the analyzed is made up of knowledge, memory, and experience, is it not? What one knows is what one has to analyze. And knowledge is essentially what is known, what is the past. But the past is not now. The past is memory of it. Memory can be faulty. The image-making process doesn't collect everything exactly, perfectly. So the analyzer, then, is limited in analysis. And so, oftentimes it appears that most of us take to feeding ourselves with analysis that could one day come to a complete picture. The truth of the matter. And at the same time, conflict erupts as to the limitations of such an approach. So then, if the analyzed makes up the analyzer, is there a fixed analyzer? Or is the analyzer relative to the analyzed? Perhaps time and space being relative provides us a clue, wherein the observer and the observed are relative to one another. So, returning to the question of whether thought is always limited. Perhaps the question of whether thought exists within relative time and space. So if it is thought conjured within relative time and space, then the thinker, being oneself, the psychological self, is also within relative time and space. So what happens then? Thought is seen for its limitations, and yet it's the only instrument, the only tool that we have to get around in our day-to-day life, to distinguish between this and that, and to distinguish between then and now. And at the same time, the computer is getting more sophisticated at those three very things. And the factor of money, which is a human invention, and is the lubricant of which solves for conflict between all the different variations of thought's limitations, of which result in outer conflict. When the computer can do the tasks the great majority of people, will the human be able to see for oneself in general and on a mass enough scale to live with the fact that the observer is the observed, and that if the human being continues to, as it has for centuries, live as though it is not, the sort of conflict that money, position, and power, all of which are conjured and based on thought's limitation, will no longer lubricate, create a buffer between oneself and another. So, sets a question then as to whether thought is always limited. It's becoming more and more relevant, despite the fact that time and space has always been relative for the entirety of the human history. But as to what it means for day-to-day living, then, does thought always be being limited further emphasize that acceptance is the key? Because just like acceptance, one that is not based on choice is a general resolution inwardly and thus outwardly. Thought and its limitation in general is also not a fragmented or divided approach. So the two run concurrent. such as the observer and observed, can run concurrent as well.